It's an honor to be a participant in the STM conference. Several years ago, I went to Columbia University. It was the fall of 2001. And I agreed to give a series of presentations to alumni groups around the Mid-Atlantic region. That January, I found myself driving down the New Jersey Turnpike from New York to Philadelphia to speak to the Eastern Pennsylvania Club. Got across the bridge into the city, found the hotel. It was a snowy evening. Parked the car, got into the room where the presentation was to be delivered. My talk was to begin at 8 o'clock, but by 8:15, there was only one other person in the room. I proposed that I should go ahead and give my talk. She agreed. I was using slides that evening, and I asked if she would run the slides as I talked. I gave the talk. It was a really good talk that night. I remember it well. And afterwards, I sat down I asked if there were any questions, and she said no. And I sat down in the front row. I said, I've got this long ride back to the city. It's late. I'm going to go out. I'm going to leave. She said, no, you're going to stay. I said, no, I've got meetings in the morning. It's snowing. I got to deal with the turnpike. I got to get out of here. She said, no, you're going to stay. I said, you don't get it. I've got a long ride back to New York City. It's late. I've got meetings in the morning. I'm leaving. She said, no, you don't understand. I'm the second speaker. So, I just want to thank you for being here this morning. So I have two objectives in my remarks today. First, I'd like to highlight some of the key developments in thinking and action in the research library community, both within the US and around the world, and to suggest some areas of prospective partnership between STM publishers and the research library community. The title I was asked to speak to was Libraries and Scholarly Publishing in a Time of Disruption and Turmoil, the Prospects, my word, Radical Collaboration. I thought that was a boring title. So I came up with a series of others that might be more appropriate. This title suggests that it's probably not possible to predict what we are and where we're going. This is from Ken Kesey, who you might remember wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And it's not possible, obviously, to count the apples in the seed. We're also always struggling to find new directions, new aspirations, new things to accomplish. And I'll speak to a little bit about that within the context of the library community. We also have this public image, what I call the trompe-l'oeil library. And if we sort of lift up the screen and look behind what's really going on in those libraries, it's dramatically different than the public understanding and perception, and I would suggest maybe yours as well. In the education of Henry Adams, it is noted that, that order breeds habit while chaos breeds life. And I think we have a responsibility to rethink the way researchers create, communicate, and preserve their work. And I would argue that there are opportunities for us to do that in productive and effective ways together. And when I get up in the morning, I often think in the term of thesis, but by the time I go to bed at night, at least in the current environment, sometimes I find the scream is a better thing to prepare me for a night of good sleep. We have moved, I think, rapidly from a period of what I call kumbaya, a lot of holding of hands across the library community and in partnership with others, and I argue that we need to radicalize our working relationships and to build more systemic national and global partnerships. I'd like to start by talking about some of the key trends which are driving the development of the university and its libraries. I read a journal article recently, I think maybe it was one of your journals, that noted in that 1997, there were 16,407 people working in the United States as Elvis impersonators. In 2017, that number had actually increased to 83,207. And if that trend continues, 1 out of 3 people in this room, no. So what are some of the key trends? Well, obviously, we're wrestling with extraordinary shifts in user behaviors and expectations. What historically they've wanted from the library, we are finding that it is very different. I'll talk a bit more about that later. We continue to maintain largely redundant, inefficient library operations. We're all historically been doing the same things, repeating each other's work. We have found some ways to do that. OCLC is a great example of shared cataloging, interlibrary loan document delivery, but the multiplication of work across the research library community is quite bewildering. We've given up some of our traditional service paradigms. We've moved into the community that we serve and moved from behind the desks in the library. We're putting a lot of focus on unique resources as we build sort of the collective collection strategies, which we'll talk a bit more about. We recognize that there's opportunities to build more scale and network effects through the aggregation of our collections, our services, and our capacities. And it's all about the apps. It's the importance of collective innovation. And here are some others. You can read through the screen and note some of the extraordinary trends I think that we're dealing with in our world, which I would argue also touch your world. The economic context is continuing to challenge us. We have obviously fewer resources to work with. We continue to find new innovative ways to increase our capacity, our financial capacity. We're building much more effective collaboration on a global scale, moving out of our states, our regions, our nations. We also recognize that this is a constant change environment, a condition of mutability, that historically we have not had that sort of receptivity and openness within our professional community, the library community, to be supportive and responsive to that constant state of change. Each year, the EDUCAUSE and the New Media Coalition carry out an analysis of the technologies that are going to have an important impact on the work of universities and, by extension, the work of libraries. What I've called out in this screen and the screen that follows are the technologies that they thought were particularly relevant as we look out over the next 5 years or so. Now, obviously, many of these things are already embedded in our world. The mobile and tablet realities, the increasing importance of moving to the cloud, the geo-everything, which defines so many of our disciplines, the extraordinary importance of linking and connecting structured information, more and more focus on the semantic web and on smart objects. I mean, even if the microwaves can spy at us in the White House, think about what other things might be able to do in terms of linking the physical world with information. We will talk more about issues around open content, the ability to distribute widely and repurpose, and certainly the challenge of electronic books. I know that most of the publishers in this room focus on journals, but we are wrestling through an extraordinary revolution in electronic books, and we're not doing a very good job, and I'll come back to that theme later. We are learning to be a partner in the big data, big science environment, building more of a capacity to work in the RIM world. And games and visualizations and simulations and 3D printing, all of those have entered the university and the libraries in very aggressive ways and are reshaping the ways we work with our users and the way we provide services and content. So given these trends, what are some of the implications for what we are, who you work with within the library community? Well, we've done a lot of things over many, many years, many centuries, in fact. And we have to ask the question, do the things that we have done, do those 20th century skills still matter? The ability to select, to get, to organize, to enable people to navigate and find, to share, to help people to understand and use and apply information. And that ultimate responsibility that we have really tried to pursue, and increasingly in a failing way, is the archiving of information, which to me is one of the extraordinary opportunities for partnership between our communities. We keep our eye on the work that we do in support of teaching and research and scholarship. And so there's a shifting vision of what the library is. We have this legacy, this responsibility for centuries of information. We have built an infrastructure of content, of technology, of expertise that is increasingly important. We are taking on that sort of repository responsibility, that ongoing accessibility and usability of the information that's being produced. We're trying to guide our users to the best sources of information, that gateway function that we have historically played. The platform, the application, the apps. We're also learning how to think differently about the economy of the library and the economy of the university, trying to leverage our assets to produce new streams of revenue that help us to be better positioned to support the needs of our universities and our users. And we also function very aggressively in the interest of the publics that we serve. This probably hits most importantly in the area of our work on information policy, both at the national and the international level. And I'll come back to that because, again, based on my experience, having worked over 30, 40 years in the information policy area, there are opportunities for us not to be at war with each other, but to be working together in areas of interest that we share. So what's the implications for staffing as we make this shift from 20th century skills to new types of roles and vision for what we are as library? We are bringing in lots of people with very diverse academic backgrounds. You would think that the work of the library is largely carried out by people who have master's degrees in library science from accredited library schools around the world. We have such a burgeoning range of new professional assignments in most of our libraries that rule has really been altered. A number of years ago, I wrote a paper which was published in Library Journal, which actually got me into a lot of trouble, but that's a good thing. And the title of that paper was Raised by Wolves, the New Feral Professional in the Academic Library. And of course, people started websites, Feral Librarian, conferences were organized around ferality and all that good stuff. But what I was arguing is that the work of the library as it is evolving, yes, continues to need that professional credential, which is the MLS in library science. But there are lots of other things that we're doing. And when I stepped down from my responsibilities at Columbia at the end of 2014, I asked the human resources staff at the library to do an analysis of the academic credentials of the 330 professionals that we had on staff at Columbia at that time. And what we discovered was that 60% of the professional staff did not have the master's degree in library science. So the people you're working with and interacting with in the library community over time has shifted pretty dramatically. I think it's important to understand what impact has that had on the values, the outlooks, and the styles, and the sort of understanding, recognition, and respect that might exist within an academic community in the working relationship between faculty, administration, libraries, and I would argue the working relationship with publishers. We've also, as a result, I think, built much more messy, fluid organizational structures. I was very interested at Columbia to build what I call maverick units that may be funded only at 70 to 80% of their budget, and we're required to be innovative and entrepreneurial in finding 20 to 30% from other sources to maintain their operations. And I think that spirit of risk-taking and entrepreneurship is part of the library community that you'll be working with. So since I talk about human resource issues a lot, I was finally asked, well, Jim, when you interview somebody, what are you looking for? So I decided I'd better put together a list. And so I prepared this agenda of the things that I think are absolutely critical as we build the future academic research library staff. Now, obviously, not one person is going to bring all of those qualities and capabilities to the work of the library. Clearly, a subject, process, or technical expertise is fundamental to any assignment. But as you work your way down through that list, you can see there are some common qualities that we're looking for, but also some extraordinary capacities that we need to increasingly make available, whether it's the ability to develop new resources, to build new businesses, to engage politically. These are increasingly important to our successful work in the academic library and in our effective working relationship with you. Scholarly integrity and productivity. It's an area that I've worked in since the early 1970s in my partnership and working relationship with publishers and with researchers at many institutions. As we build digital libraries, the published licensed content, the stuff that we get from you, continues to be probably the largest part of what we might call our digital library. But we are finding more and more content that we are digitizing out of our unique resources, our special collections. A few of us have figured out how important it is to build and retain permanently archived web content. Internet Archive does a very important job, but it tends to be episodic and reaching across the top of the web. And billions of objects, web objects, created and lost every day. We are the archives of our communities, of our campuses, so institutional content, and of course the increasing importance of partnering with our researchers to collect their data. What we know across all these different forms of digital library content is that it's increasingly multimedia, it's increasingly integrated with services and dependent on applications. We've learned that quality does not just equal content, quality equals content plus functionality, what I'm able to do with that information. And you as publishers have understood that and have begun to build very robust working environments in the use of scholarly data and scholarly information. But having created digital materials, we also have this fundamental responsibility to preserve and archive that content. You cannot preserve what you don't have, and that's an argument that seems to be increasingly lost in the library community as we begin to migrate, if you will, away from collections to services. You have to be able to sustain that accessibility, that usability, and to care for that material as technologies shift over time. I would argue that we've done a modest job over the centuries in terms of preserving our analog information, but as we've converted information, digitized materials, and as we've tried to wrestle through the extraordinary challenges of born digital information, we have fundamentally failed. We have failed as publishers, and we have failed as libraries. If you write a paper and you include in your references a series of sources that are born digital objects, web documents, web sites, and a year later I come to read your paper, obviously, and I want to understand the sources of information that led you to your conclusions. And I search, and I can't find the stuff because it's been lost or taken down or moved or changed. I would argue that ability to consult evidence and sources is fundamental. And if I can't do that, I have to say, well, did you make this up? So that scholarly integrity in terms of the increasing relevance and importance of born digital resources to information. And our ability to think and write and research about this period in our lives, the politics, the economics, the science, the culture, will be compromised if the information which is born digital is not available, not usable, and that, I think, is a scholarly integrity issue as well. I would also argue where research work is being deposited and accessed has led to a condition which I call repository chaos. And I'm going to come back to that in a second because I think it's a very important one. So think about the extraordinary range of born digital content that we're being asked to work with. Last year, let's start with the sort of standard stuff, e-journals and e-books. E-journals, I participated in the Mellon meeting that was convened, it must be over 10 years ago, where we conceived of a new strategy for public publisher-library partnership around preserving e-journal information. It led to the creation under the Ithaca umbrella of Portico. And of course, we also had Locke's Clocks, supported and coordinated out of Stanford. Well, 2 years ago, Columbia University, 3 years ago, Columbia University and Cornell University, which were in a working relationship, decided to look at the 180,000 e-journals that we both acquired, licensed from publishers, and to check those against the Portico and the Locke's Clocks database, to find out how many of them were actually being preserved. And to our shock, maybe we shouldn't have been surprised, we found that 17% were actually being preserved. And if there was only one issue, we counted it as being preserved. That means 83% were not being preserved. Now, many of the publishers in this room have been aggressive and really supportive of this effort and have made their information available. But there's a lot of what I would call other types of research information that publishers have also sent to Portico, not the sort of the core journal paper, but related information. And that material is not being made available through Portico. E-books, there's probably, it's a disaster. We simply do not have a national or global strategy for capturing, organizing, and preserving permanently access to e-books that have been created. Last year, about 250,000 new books were published by trade and academic presses. About 250,000 more were published by independent and small presses, and 500,000 new books were published independently, self-published. These, I think, challenge us because so many of them are E in their origin, but very little effort to capture them, to make decisions on what should be captured and preserved. And you can look down through this list, and I'll have a second screen, of the wide variety of content of born digital materials that I think are increasingly challenging us in libraries to be able to support the needs of our user community today and going forward. It's obvious that government is operating perhaps 90% electronically. Social media. The Library of Congress announced several years ago that it was going to take care of Twitter. They still haven't done it. When somebody gives personal papers to a library, I was able to acquire the papers at Columbia of Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, and he gave us 5 hard drives of email information on 7 different email operating systems. Probably really important to understanding the world of jazz and poetry and political activism. What were we going to do with that stuff? We are also partnering with numerous human rights organizations around the world, serving as their archives. And huge amounts of their interaction and communication and reporting is web-based. And so what do we do with that? Well, we collected 100 million pages of web material on human rights, and we basically picked a few pieces of sand off the beach of human rights information. And of course, lots of other things, spatial data, apps, video games, medical data with all its privacy, RSS feeds, visualizations, lots of stuff that increasingly matter to the worlds of learning and research, but which are not being captured and not being preserved. I mentioned the repository chaos. It used to be that scholars would deposit their papers in one place, the publisher repository, and we would have sort of a dependable way to access and use that information. But now they're putting it everywhere, into their discipline repositories, their institutional repositories. When there's data involved, schools and departments in colleges have them. I put it up on my personal website. Governments require that you put it up on their sites. Some countries are requiring national repositories. So it's an extraordinary array. Which copy is used? Which copy is cited? Which copy is preserved? Which copy is not changed? I think this is an issue for us, and of course the ability to text and data mine across these extraordinary scholarly databases is also of increasing importance. We're all familiar with the increasing efforts by government and by granting agencies to enable and, if not require, the preservation and accessibility of the data that's produced as part of research. And many of you as publishers have addressed this in very substantive and important ways. We all know these are massive. They're generally unstructured. They need curation. People want to extract. They want to distribute. They want to collaborate. They want to be able to visualize and simulate the data. But we have the long-term responsibility in the area of preservation. So much of our effort is focused on responding to the government mandates, the funder mandates, and responding to these usability issues, but not always focused on that long-term preservation and usability. We are trying to figure out new ways in the library community to support the needs of research. We sit down with researchers all the time, and we ask them and talk to them, and in some cases even are in the laboratories observing their work, both physical and virtual laboratories. They tell us that they need new ways to navigate and analyze and synthesize information, particularly when they move outside of their own areas of expertise. How do they integrate disparate sources and gray literature from other fields into their work? They want to understand more effectively what we talk about when we're talking about open research, and the notion that there is a continuous process of scholarly communication, that it's not writing the paper, submitting it, having it accepted, publishing it. There's an ongoing conversation and connectivity around that work. It's a process, it's not just a product. They are asking for new thinking around databases of subject ontologies that help them to understand how disciplines and multidisciplines are organized. We mentioned data management. So what we're trying to develop in the academic research library world is more of what I've come to call a special library informationalist model, where the library community is not in the library, but is in the classroom, in the laboratory, at the bedside, participating in the professional services, the teaching, but also the research work that's going on. We have some meta issues that have developed around our digital library work. We are increasingly concerned about mass surveillance. We're watching very carefully the new, although it's turned out not to be new, initiative to check equipment and social media and web content as people cross borders, as serious potential violations of privacy. We've seen a number of organizations, big organizations, experience security meltdowns, and therefore not just the opening up of personal information, but the unavailability of data and services. We're wrestling and fighting through the battle of network neutrality, the future telecommunications policy in the US and around the world. How do we guarantee an open internet, an open web that does not make it more favorable for individuals who have political clout and have more economic power? I think this is an ongoing battle around equity of access. And of course, we in the library community worry and think about corporate control. We think about the control of discovery. We think about the control of content. And I think there are opportunities for us to think differently about how we work together. We are focused very much on our users. Our institutions, the governments who fund us, are asking us very hard questions. They say, how do you know your users are satisfied? How do you know that you're penetrating the markets that we've asked you to serve? How do you know you're successful, have impact, are being cost effective? How do you design systems for usability? A number of years ago, I also got in trouble by giving a paper at an Association of College and Research Libraries conference. And the title of that paper was Stop the Madness, the insanity of return on investment as a way to measure the success of the work of libraries. We don't know how to do ROI research well. Value research, where we try to understand the financial value of what we do and the impact of what we do as we migrate from product to service, as we try to draw some relationship between our actions and our benefit. This is pretty sophisticated research. And public libraries and academic libraries around the world that have attempted to demonstrate value and impact through ROI analysis, the very smart people who sit on our boards and who run our institutions see through that stuff very quickly. And so I think there's opportunities, given the sophisticated knowledge you have about how scholars work and our work with the researchers and faculty in our settings, to really begin to look at ways to carry forward far more rigorous, far more sophisticated, and far more important value research about what you have created in partnership with researchers and faculty, and what we're helping our faculty and researchers create and accomplish. Charles Kuralt, the late newscaster, once noted that thanks to the interstate highway system in the United States, I can travel from New York to San Francisco and see absolutely nothing. The infrastructure's necessary but insufficient. Our users obviously want more and better content, they want more access, they want convenience, they want to do new things they've never been able to do before. Everyone's trying to manage costs and productivity. People want to participate and control their information environments. We need to keep these expectations in mind as we build and refine access to information. It's very hard, I think, for us to draw a line between what we do as publishers and what we do as libraries in relationship to the human objectives. How do we know? We can sort of measure how much people do, although there are some questions about the accuracy of the tools we've put in place there. But we can talk about success. Are our users, readers, happy? Are we helping them to be more productive? Are we enabling them to make more progress in their lives, build new relationships, partnerships around the globe in terms of their research area? Are we providing them with good experiences and allowing them to have impact in their world? I would argue we don't have good ways to think about, much less measure in a qualitative way, these important aspects of what I call the human objectives. Why people work with us as publishers and why people come to us as libraries. In many settings, I've said we've got to be able to demonstrate why we are essential, because communities and decision makers want to understand why are they investing in these publishers? Why are they investing in these libraries? Do we add to student success, faculty productivity? Do we contribute to the economy? Do we support the values of the institutions that we serve? And are we enhancing that community reputation? We have to be virtual, obviously. We need to be able to support our students and faculty around the world, but we also need to have that continuing commitment to virtuosity. We need to be expert partners with you and expert partners with our students and the faculty. But we also have to have the sustained virtuosity, a commitment to the public interest, to find new ways to work and collaborate together. And I think that's our challenge, is working through those V's in order to become more effective organizations. We make decisions mostly by the seat of our pants. Research and development has never been a central component of the work of universities, much less their libraries. We need to begin to figure out in a more aggressive way how to solve real problems through real analysis and research. And true R&D has its greatest impact, I would argue, when it combines the interest that I have as a professional or a researcher, that it is important to the institution, the organization I serve. It has larger professional importance to the publisher community, the library community, and it has a national or even global need. And it's that national need that leads to the type of funding that we want. I want to recommend an article to you. If you haven't seen it, it's a pretty extraordinary analysis of the future of information work. And I would argue it's the work that we do as libraries, universities, and the work that you do as publishers. It's Context for Information Work, written by Marina Gorbis in the EDUCAUSE Review, May-June 2016. Take a look at it. She talks about 5 things. I'd like to spend a minute on this. She talks about smart machines, the increasing importance of smart machines, about our relationship with our tools, the importance of the robots, if you will. Not a matter of replacing human labor, but augmenting human performance. Small-scale manipulation, things that humans may not be able to do. Dangerous locations, places where people may not be able to go. Rational thinking, something that humans are not always capable of. I thought that was kind of interesting, actually. Coordination economics, socially structured value creation, teams assembled in the cloud, bridging borders, redefining the way we structure and manage organizations. She talks about the importance of micro-workers, orchestrating complex tasks across the world. To me, this is something you, as publishers, have already done a lot of work in, but we in universities and libraries have not. Blended reality, the virtual and the physical seamlessly coming together and integrated. Social networking, an example of that, but 24/7 global teams leaving digital work trails for more precise performance and productivity measures. I think that was really interesting in terms of how the work of information organizations might proceed. The maker mindset, which opens up the possibility for people all over the world in the maker and the hacker movements to really become part of the work that we do, increasing and extending that work into the developing world, using crowdfunding as a way to raise the resources to develop interesting applications and capacities. And then this opportunity for globalization and inclusion, which I think is really important. She talks about global labor arbitrage, the focus on increasing literacy and media skills around the world, of building a robust, successful open telecommunications infrastructure that allows people with disabilities, young people, elderly, people in developing world to participate in the global economy. I was blown away by this article, and I encourage you to take a look at it because it's being actively talked about within the broader research community. Can we work together? I was at Penn State for 7 years, and I remember vividly a professor of physics at that university making a decision, having worked his entire life trying to discover a universal theory of matter. And next to the campus at Penn State, there's this mountain called Mount Nittany, and he decided to climb the mountain and to engage God, who happened to live on the top of that mountain. And reaching the top, he said, God, I need to understand. I've spent my whole life. Can you tell me whether there will ever be a universal theory of matter? And God went off and thought for a little bit and came back, and she said, yes, there will be a universal theory of matter, but not in your lifetime. So he thought about this a little bit as he climbed down from the mountain. He says, you know, all my work's going to pay off in something because it's actually going to be successful. And the word spread across campus. And finally, the president of that university, of Penn State, decided she also needed to climb that mountain. And when she reached the top, because she had important questions, she said, God, I need to know, will the cost of libraries and computing ever come under control at my institution? And God went off and thought for days and days and days about this challenge, and finally came back and she said, Ms. President, yes, the cost of libraries and computing will come under control at your institution, but not in my lifetime. So, I have worked for decades on the challenges of information policy. This is a brief inventory of the stuff that we care about in universities and libraries, and I know you care about as publishers. We are seeing the most extraordinary threats to intellectual freedom, civil liberties, and privacy that we have ever experienced before. It's a battle that we need to fight together. We need to make sure that education programs and research programs are funded by our national governments, that the internet and telecommunications policy support accessibility and equitable access to information. We need to find a way to work together in what I call the copyright wars. I've been there for the last 25 years. I've been testifying before congressional committees. I have served on national task forces, including the 108 study group for 3 years, have worked with publishers in a variety of copyright discussions, and we need to sort of step back and figure out, is there some common ground for us to build a energized and modernized approach to copyright rights and responsibilities in this new digital environment. And I think I would like to find a way to do that, because I think we owe it to ourselves to find that. But having said that, librarians are becoming much more political animals. working to educate ourselves on many of these policy issues, being advocates at the local, national, and global level for the things that our communities care about, educating our communities to build advocacy, to build partnerships around these political issues, and to make sure that we are supporting and advancing the things that we hold and value. I mentioned earlier about the importance of beginning to think moving from kumbaya to more radical collaboration. Libraries have always been active in this cooperative space. Starting back in the 1930s and 1940s, we recognized that the duplication of effort was just not appropriate and necessary. And we could save resources and do a better job by collaborating across different venues. And you can read here the various ways in which the library community has worked together. We also are increasingly reaching out to the cultural community, seeing more partnership between libraries, archives, and museums. And we also have this opportunity, I think, to build more public-private partnerships, working relationships between universities, libraries, and the for-profit sector. We see that happening in infrastructure development. We see that happening in the digitization of book materials, the Google Book Project, and others. And I think that it's an untapped way for us to work together. But I also think we need to figure out how to radicalize that collaboration. There's an African, Ethiopian actually, proverb that says there's two types of people in the world. First, there are the mountain people who no matter how closely they come together, they always stand side by side. And then there are the river people who, no matter how far apart they may begin, they always ultimately flow together. And so I think this moving to radical collaboration is about advancing us in a much more effective and aggressive way to work together. All of us cannot be, in the university and library sense, centers for excellence. We need to have complementary strategies, so we're not all trying to compete and build the same things. The mass production work, which I mentioned earlier, why does every library have to have an acquisitions department, cataloging department, preservation department, digitization department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? It makes no sense. We should be building regional network support centers that can carry out that work. And as we build new infrastructures and new initiatives, we need to start working from the start together rather than thinking about it after the fact. Columbia and Cornell University wrestled through this idea several years ago and tried to build what we call the first real radical partnership, a bilateral relationship between two institutions. Columbia University Libraries, CUL. Cornell University Libraries, CUL. We had our name. Too cool. And that's what we used. And we're actually ready for the third one. So if Catholic or Colgate want to join us, it's going to be Trey Cool. So what do we mean by innovation? Libraries and publishers, I think, are trying to maintain that core business as we also try to expand and improve our markets, producing new goods and new services to more people. We're thinking about how we improve the benefits of what we do, add value, and how we help with solutions. Libraries are thinking a lot about what we are and what we do, how we are viewed and understood and perceived in your community as well as in the communities that we serve, and fundamentally shifting how we do it. This is a hard transition for libraries that have been core valued and tradition-based. But I think if you look around the country, libraries have moved very far beyond their core responsibility for acquiring, organizing, and preserving information and building a whole suite of new roles and responsibilities in the work of the university. So how can we build new relationships? Obviously, scholarly communication is a complex phenomena. I'm speaking to people who know more about this than I do. Creation, evaluation, distribution, use, and preservation. This is the stuff that we try to manage around the scholarly communication process. We know the economics, the technologies, the players, and the policies are shifting pretty dramatically. We know that it's a suite of communities, and libraries have played a very important role at the creation, distribution, consumption, and use levels. And so we've been thinking for years and years where we fit into the production side, of the scholarly communication equation. I think each of these venues offer opportunities for increasing working relationship and partnership. We also, as we move forward, as I know you do, to understand why do our faculty publish? Clearly, this is their way to communicate. It's part of the academic culture in which they've been raised. It's the way their ideas get preserved. It's the way they achieve prestige and recognition. And for those noble few, there is opportunities for personal profit. I'm going to skip here. The education community, I think, has been focused for decades on a core set of objectives. We want policies for intellectual property which enable broad and easy distribution and reuse of materials by scholars and students, and a much more competitive and supportive market for scholarly communication and creative work. And I think we've seen some growth in these areas, but I think there's a lot more that we could work on together. We want, in the research community, a competitive market. We want ways to distribute and reuse this material. We want innovative applications of technology, and I think we're seeing a lot of that happening in the publisher community. We don't want to give up quality, obviously, and I think there's a lot of initiatives that are compromising quality in the scholarly communication and publishing venue, and we've got to continue to work together on that permanent archiving. Researchers tell us a lot. They want to be recognized. They want to contribute to that scholarly literature. Through their work, they want to produce much higher level instructional experiences. They want to be responsible for successful students. They want to collaborate with interesting colleagues around the world. They want their own work to be recognized and to advance their careers. They want to experiment with technology, and not just in their own research, but in the distribution and use of their work around the world. So can we build a different working relationship between publishers and libraries? We need to find better forums to consult on priorities and strategies for collaboration. I don't know where that conversation does take place and where it can take place in a more systemic way. Having worked from the mid-90s on innovative electronic publishing projects with presses, I think there's still opportunity for us to find ways to do that. We have a shared public policy advocacy strategy, and we need to come to the table. I learned that strange bedfellows and partnerships are necessary in the political environment. Think of the power of the publisher, university, and library community showing up in Geneva, showing up in Washington, and singing the same song about some of the key political concerns that we have. How do we build more of a joint conversation for us with researchers and authors? Rather than library talking to them and publisher talking to them, let's talk about it together. There are opportunities for professional development and training. I've done a lot of workshops for publisher groups around the US, and it's always a very useful, productive conversation. We need to step back and think differently about licensing. Is there a new way that we can model contracts in terms of their terms and their objectives? Standards. I was the president, or whatever it was called, the chair of the board of the National Information Standards Organization for a number of years. I think NISO and its other national equivalents, as well as the international version, I think offer us opportunities to really develop not guiding principles or best practices, but true standards that can help guide our work. And you can read down through a lot of those other things, many of which I have talked about. But I want to give particular attention again to the one important message I want to leave, and that is, can we find a way as publisher, university, and library to focus on the preservation and archiving of scholarly work and on the tools and evidence and documentation that our researchers are using to produce their scholarly work. So where are we going? Libraries have been through an extraordinary period. Higher education libraries, just like research publishing, blew up in a very positive way from the 1950s to the 1970s. as the US and other countries built their R&D capacity and decided to drive that through their universities. We had a period of discord, economic discord, debates and conflict, if you will, between the publisher and library community, largely over issues of price. But then this digital revolution happened in the 1990s, and I argue we had this sort of 20 years of decadence where we just could get anything we wanted, and we had all this electronic stuff, and we were able to really increase in very powerful ways the amount and quality of the information. Think about it as packages of information and huge retrospective databases. I think we're in this period of polygamy, where we'll marry anybody and partner with anybody. It's that kumbaya phenomena. But I argue we need to step back into, I figured you were STM, you would know what parabiosis was. You don't, I know. Parabiosis is a term of sharing body parts, body organs, body systems. Think of Siamese twins. We need to get there, if you will, the river people, and build that synergy across the publisher and library community. Because we're moving, I think, to a period of particularism, where deep specialization and expertise, virtuosity, will increasingly define libraries, as I think it also defines, over time, many publishers. Some final thoughts. I think we need to revisit primal innovation as part of our DNA. We need to advance that radical collaboration. We need to take apart, deconstruct what it is we are and put it back together. What is a 21st century publisher? What is a 21st century university? What does a 21st century library look like? I don't think we've asked those questions. Will we survive? And I would argue under this impact of particularism and the importance of the indispensability that we want to have to the researchers in our community. We want to be relevant. We want to have impact. We want to add value. We want to survive. We don't want to become extinct. I saw a play in New York several years ago called Extinction, and I learned, to my surprise, that there are two kinds of extinction. First, there's terminal, when the species disappears and there are no descendants. But then I learned there's a second kind of extinction. It's called phyletic extinction, where one species evolves into another. And I decided survival was possible. And it's phyletic is now part of my vocabulary. And I think our ability to partner and work together will certainly enable both of our communities, both of our industries, to continue to survive, add value, and have relevance. When Albert Einstein came to the United States, he did not like to fly. Now, as I head out to the airport immediately after my talk to fly back to New York, I get a little worried. If Einstein wouldn't do it, why would I? But he used to travel around the United States by train all the time. And on one such trip, he was sitting, and he saw the young man coming around to collect the tickets, and he started digging in his pockets, looking for his ticket. And the young man got to him and said, "Oh, no, Dr. Einstein. You don't have to worry about it. You don't need to find your ticket. Don't worry about it." But Einstein persisted, and he crawled on the floor, and he lifted up his seat. And again, the young man said, "Dr. Einstein, please don't worry. You don't need to find your ticket." Well, Einstein turned around, looked him in the eye, and said, "Young man, it is no longer a matter of whether I can find my ticket. It's a matter of where I am going." So let's spend less time looking for our tickets, and let's spend more time thinking about where we are going together. Thank you.